va parler de Céline Carré with Saint-Gobain. Energy renovation rates are still very low, and but we know that still too many renovations do not target energy performance. So an idea which is being explored in a couple of countries, for example in France, is to ensure that whenever there is a renovation, energy is being considered. That's one of the items covered in the transition energetic. And another one with worst building is to set a date by which worst performing buildings, for example private residentials, should be renovated. That's also an element that we're being looked at. Just two examples.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Adrien Boulier, working at Intelligent Energy Europe, so I feel like in family here today. And so energy efficiency in Horizon 2020, closely working with DG Ener's team on building and finance. So myself, I'm working rather on the finance part, also working with the ethic group where Paula showed a slide. Got many things because we had many presentations and you kept us from speaking before. But one key point, actually talking about ethic, we're talking with the financial institutions on energy efficiency, and they're saying we've got a lot of money, but we're looking for projects. And because what they're saying is there are so many barriers to uptake of energy efficiency that need to be addressed before finance. So I think finance is a real issue, and we are working on that, but it's clearly not the only issue. Talking about finance, I was very happy to see, I think it was in Oliver and Bogdan's presentation, mention of transaction costs as a parameter in the investment, because I think it's a key issue and you never see anything on that. So talking about models, also I think the debate on discount rates could go forever. Don't know which model is the right one, and I wouldn't make a position on that, but it seems to me that discount rates reflects your preference for present, and normally in any calculation model that's free, risk-free interest rate plus something. So if you put it at 3% over 25 years, that already sounds a bit low anyway. Not saying it should be 17%, but one of the things that I found very interesting in Barbara's figures is that out of 157 million tons of oil equivalent that can be saved on buildings, 28 are on domestic hot water, which compares to 45 on the envelope. And I think we tend to focus a lot on the envelope, but hot water is a big issue. And it would be interesting to see a bit more in the debate on what we are doing to save energy on domestic hot water. Question again to Oliver, this change of the measures that are cost effective between your worst and your best scenario sounds very weird to me. I'd like to hear a bit more what parameters you changed. Did you change the discount rates? And that magically changes everything. And the last thing I would like to say to make Paola's life easier is there's a lot of things that can be done at EU level, but actually when you look at it, a lot of it is in the member states' hands, and it has to be done. And I think what a lot of you are doing now, working at the national level on roadmaps and so on, is probably a very good way also to address this, because we can only do so much at the European level. So that's it.
There is some questions, and but I think we take maybe more, and if some of the people who have been asked to answer questions want to do it, please raise your hand. But if there's any, Didier?
Didier Mosbeuf from the French Energy Efficiency Agency, and I'm coordinating the Odyssey project where some presentation mentioned. I have a good news. Is that refurbishment works. I did the refurbishment personally last year, 30,000 euro refurbishment, and I still not have opened my space heating. And we are end of November, so it works. Now, in terms of policies, we have been participating in the insurance project, and I was responsible of the French scenario, I may say. And we have tested, of course, different scenarios. One was on taxation. And there were a lot of nice colleagues from ADEME. We are really proactive on taxation. And the result was very disappointing because the price elasticity is very low in that sector. And if you don't reach a level of more than 150 euro per ton CO2, you have no chance to change the figures. So this is the first message. Taxation doesn't work. Or it should be so high that from a public acceptance, it will be very difficult. The French government is really interested by accompanying measure. It was mentioned there about awareness, and so we have a program on training for architecture to design NZ, for instance, and also to have this one-stop shop system. So at least the French government believe on that two measures to make the difference, and they believe more on that type of policies than, for instance, taxation. But what I was more interested in, and I push it, it was a scenario where we propose an obligation of energy efficiency work in existing building. And I was surprised that there were not too much other countries who proposed that measures. And there are a domestic debate, a national debate, on how it's possible to do it, because it's easy to say. Now when you think a little bit, it's very difficult to implement that. But at least when I see the conclusion of Barbara saying we have to strengthen the regulation, the best way is obligation of energy efficiency work in regulation. I know there are some countries who are completely against that issue, but I think this is an option that we have to discuss, and we are interested to maybe engage a benchmark on if there is no application, I think, at least at the moment, but we are interested to exchange on that. The last point, from the last 1 or 2 hours, I didn't hear the word fuel poverty. And for me, something that seems bizarre, because we have several millions of people in France who are not able to eat at their level, and the policy should take into account that. So what are the regulations, or what are the policy for deep renovation targeted to this specific niche? And I would like to ask to Barbara if you have investigated the potential by category of, let's say, income level, or what is the potential in low-income household in Europe? Thank you.
Randall.
Yes, yes, my name is Randall Bowie from Rockwool International. And I'm going to ask a question only if you give me an opportunity to come back and ask an additional question.
Of course, if you have time.
Last time you didn't do that. Okay, several questions. Starting with Paula. You mentioned, Paula, the need to link incentives to the individual measures, and then you mentioned the ex-ante conditionality with the structural funds, which is very clear. Could you elaborate a bit on how you might, and this is sort of just brainstorming, how you might do that with individual legal text articles if they were to be revised, if it's possible, and have you considered that? For example, Article 4, how you might connect that in a legal text to a some type of an incentive. I know it's getting fairly difficult since you're getting into areas where member states have the prerogative there to decide themselves, but if it has been considered. And then to Barbara. Barbara, you mentioned the I believe you indicated that you're using some kind of a stock flow of engineering calculation, which implies that you do have fairly good calibration of your floor space at least someplace in the model. And I was just wondering how this compares to the other models, the one that Bogdan was referring to. I mean, to get a relative impact of the different sector, tertiary and residential mainly. That was one question. And then another one, Barbara, is when you talked about how you've used, which I thought was very interesting, the Muir database. Looking at measures where you could actually draw conclusions about which measures were best. And you got down to fairly detailed levels of financial instruments and a mixture of financial and regulatory measures. But I'm just wondering if Muir allows you to go even deeper down, like comparing different types of financial measures, like default guarantees or something. Is the database robust enough to draw even more detailed conclusions? And that's all I have right now.
Thank you. Maybe it's time to give some of the speakers opportunity to answer some of the questions. And we're both Barbara and yeah, or at least the three main speakers first.
Okay. Yes, maybe I can start. I've noted some points. First of all, you mentioned the importance of hot water, which is underestimated, and I really agree. And for me, that this shows that it's very important to have a deeper look at a very disaggregated look at consumption, at the different end users, at the different types of buildings, as Oliver also showed, and also as at the different types of actors behind, and that we really need an analysis at this level of detail, and hot water measures are important. Coming to Muir, in Muir you can separate, for example, space heating and hot water, and which gives you a picture which of the measures are really addressing hot water, and what's the importance and the share of that. Didier mentioned an obligation of energy efficiency in existing buildings in France, and it was also discussed for the European Union. I can only speak for Germany. We had this discussion for many years, and there always were proposals in this direction, and I think it would be a very powerful instrument, but I'm not sure if it's realistic really to implement in a country like Germany, because we will have a new national energy efficiency plan in the beginning of December. It was already announced, and some parts of that were already published. But this obligation will definitely not be part of that for reasons, for several reasons that at the moment it seems that there's no acceptance at the political level, but also at the level of the people for that. You also mentioned fuel poverty. I agree that it's important. We did not take that into account in this study. It was already very broad, but we did not look at this specific issue. But I think it's important to have a look at that, and that's really also a problem of data gathering, because we really need more data on that. By how to define fuel poverty and how to get these data. We are looking at surveys, at existing surveys, but maybe we also need new ways of first of all, to find the data and then to implement this in the models. And then render for your question on floor space. I cannot answer on that in detail because the calculations were done by the Technical University of Vienna. But I think they relied on data on floor space for the different types of buildings, and I assume it were data from mainly from the entrance project, but I don't know in detail. But they have, I know they rely on data by the several types of buildings, both in the residential sector and in the tertiary sector. But it's still a problem because also in Germany, for example, we do not have any official data on the floor space of tertiary buildings. We only calculate them from surveys, but it's not a primary statistical data on that. And the last question on Mühe. We have a more detailed definition of the types of measures, not only financial measures, but we go one level deeper. Therefore, it should be possible to make this calculation. Partly you can directly search for that, not only financial but more different categories in the database, but sometimes it will be necessary to do that manually because Mühe also has a very detailed description of each measure, and we are also using this description where you have some much more information on that, and at the moment we are trying to define keywords which can also be searched automatically. It's also one of the developments in the database we are
And Paula, there was also some few questions for you.
So starting maybe with your question to provoke a bit the debate where you said that that indeed in regulation makes a difference. For sure, I mean, I really started by saying what has been the impact of having, for instance, minimum requirements for energy efficiency introduced in the building codes, and that comes from EU regulation. So at the same time, we shouldn't understand, I think, that EU regulation only means new regulation. I mean, we have legislative framework in place, and regulation that is not implemented doesn't make a difference, that's for sure. So also to a bit still the debate. So another question, of course, is to prepare for the review that is due by 2017, but it's quite clearly said also in the Article 19 of the APPD that this review needs to be based on application. And the reality is that it's a complex, a technically complex directive, and we have seen that the member states are even discovering this year some provisions on existing buildings that they were not aware that were there when they negotiated. So I would not also underestimate what could be the impact of implementing properly the current EPBD. And also implementation is not only in the hands of the member states. We have quite a number of still a strong language with lots of shards on which we can base all our infringements work, and that is also we see making a difference because we see new draft measures coming from member states almost constantly. That has been a difficulty that we have seen in the follow-up of the process with Regio, that we were producing monthly updates of what was the situation for the ex-ante conditionality articles, and a monthly update was not enough because in the meantime we were receiving feedback from the member states. So really to underline that 2014 has been quite intense in terms of having member states adopting legislation at national level, and that we have strong requirements there on which we have proposed referral to court for 5 member states already this year. So just to put it a bit into perspective as well. There were also questions on the ex-ante conditionalities from you, Randa. And this idea of the ex-ante conditionalities is really now that it's being implemented for the first time. So we are also learning from it. But when the multi-annual financial framework was being negotiated, we tried to introduce many more articles from the Energy Efficiency Directive. And we only managed in the end to link it to Article 3 because the transposition deadline, let's say, was coming afterwards the kick-off of the work at national level. So that's why we succeeded with APBD to have really 4 clear articles introduced, because the transposition deadline had passed, and we could ask member states where they were. So the questions that you pose are really relevant, and indeed we also need to think even how to link further with the ex-ante conditionalities for environmental issues. For instance, to whenever another kind of environmental measure is introduced at urban level, how to make the link to energy efficiency. There are many issues that could be reinforced in a new round of financial regulations, but always having in mind that you need to link it to articles for which member states have had time to put the measures in place, because otherwise legally it doesn't fly with the regulation of cohesion funds. Also, there was the question of fuel poverty. I think that Adrian had elaborated a bit on that already. As I mentioned, the technical guidance for managing authorities, we try to introduce this link between financing and debt for renovation on the one hand, but also between financing and benchmarking and using, for instance, CPCs to identify the worst performing houses and oblige member states to really look at the level of the energy performance certificates at national level. And we have also tried to promote, for instance, the use of cohesion funds for social housing improvements. And well, Adrian knows about that as well. And the reality is that in some member states there is a lot of resistance. We had in the dialogue that we have with the member states and Regio to see where they put the funding for energy efficiency. And for instance, we were trying to make the link directly and indirectly to poverty issues and social housing, and some member states were very reluctant. So also maybe something on which we should reflect further, okay, how can we facilitate that happening at national level? So I think more or less that's what I had noted. I don't know if I forgot any other question.
And there was also a question for you, Arya.
Yeah, just a quick reaction to Adrian. I mean, basically, the different results are a factor or are an outcome of the different policy scenarios. Different policy scenarios lead to different transaction costs, lead to different discount rates. And so there is a whole chain of reaction which then comes to the different results. But I'll be happy to explain it in detail to you and show you all the assumptions in the different scenarios and how we compose the policy packages and what kind of effect that then had on transaction costs, for example. A point on fuel poverty, because that was raised by you, Didier. We issued a report on the fuel poverty situation in Europe, in all European member states, just a few months ago. We tried to develop some indicators and even look at how the situation has developed over the years. And we had to come to the conclusion that the risk of fuel poverty is increasing in most member states due to a number of factors. It's not only the increase of energy prices, but also a number of other factors. But I think we have quite some detailed data on that available on our website. And Peter, you asked about what should we do differently in the EPBD review, and I think that's of course a very complex question and not easy to answer. But maybe just one thing I'd like to mention is I think we need to start to dissect the different building categories more than we have done in the current legislation. We should definitely differentiate between residential buildings and non-residential buildings, or between privately owned buildings and commercially owned buildings. Because a commercially owned building is an investment good. Somebody is owning that to make a profit, nothing else, not to live in, to make a profit. And so it would be justified that for these types of buildings we have minimum energy performance standards Why not? It could be easily priced into the overall investment decision. It could be priced into rents and so on and so forth. And you would not put a unacceptable social burden on the poor family which is living in a building and cannot afford to renovate it for whatever reason. But commercial investors own a property, they should be able and should maybe be forced and regulated to live up to certain energy performance standards. Why not? Right now our legislation only talks about buildings and makes a little bit of differentiation for public buildings, but that's it more or less. Just as one idea.
Thank you. Maya?
Well, thanks for all these very interesting presentations. What strikes me is one point which was made on job creation, which I think is a big issue also. And as I remember, the Romanian example showed a job creation of 40,000 jobs. Do I recall this right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have a little bit more explanation on this, how this was calculated, because within eceee we had this frequently discussed, and I think this is a very important point.
We take one comment more there. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Andreas Rüdinger from French Research Institute IDRI. I just wanted to react on Adrian's comment on how do we define targets. And I think another way would be relative to additional efforts, which might be a way to get out of this discussion on updates on energy trends and reference scenarios. And this means that considering the current 27% target, we're actually talking about a 6% target, which is 6% additional effort needed compared to the 2013 reference scenario. Which I think it's really important to recall that it's about additional effort. And a second figure on additional effort is that the 40% scenario as proposed by the Commission, the impact assessment study, it relates to an additional effort in terms of real energy savings of about 355 megatons of oil equivalent, which is even lower than our target for 2020. I think we completely lost this debate on, and it's directly related to what we're discussing today on what is the potential and how can we get there. But I think that's another way on getting the target right. It's about additional efforts. We want to go away from a macroeconomic hypothesis, which can change every 2 years and they will change it again, but it's about additional efforts. And the second way to get there is about sectoral targets. And I think the nearly zero energy building standard for new buildings is a very good example. It gives a pretty good identifiable long-term horizon for all market actors, and we need such a thing for existing buildings. And there might be a way to get this on the European level, not expressed in a single figure of primary consumption per square meter per year, but maybe in the idea of saying, okay, by 2020 or by 2030 we want the thermal regulation for existing buildings to be at about 150% of new buildings, which could enable every country to have its own regulation behind it, but still we have a clear long-term target on where do we need to go in terms of deep retrofits, where industry has to go, and what to do behind it. And my last point on Didier's comment on taxation, I think there are two components behind it. It's the direct impact of energy taxation and reaction by investors or actors. But the real point here is about how do we get the public money to make more incentives and more financing happening. And if we take the German example, I mean, the German society still is not going into the streets every day protesting against the high levy for renewable energies and high power prices. And still they're paying about 24 billion euros per year for renewable energies, and Germany is only investing 2 billion euros per year on energy efficiency. So how far could we go on the European level in creating a real energy efficiency levy on all kinds of energy, which in my view could be needed to secure the financing?
I would also like myself then to give a comment on DGS on energy taxation, because I think I agree, if you look on a tax by itself as the only measure, it will not be able to deliver the savings we need. But a tax in combination with other measures can be very important. And I have for years been arguing that what is the effective thing is a combination of measures. And what we have seen in Denmark, if we have a regulation for existing building or new buildings, if you combine that with a tax which make it more economic feasible, then the regulation is much more acceptable and work much better. So I think taxes work in combination with regulation and change of behavior and information, but not by standing alone. So and we very often say, well, we need to measure effect of each individual measures, and sometimes that's stupid. We need to measure effect of baskets of measures because they work together. But that was my personal view. We had a comment here.
Hi, my name is Dorothy Dula from Climate Action Network Europe. I just wanted to raise the point about improvement of the definitions in the legislation and improvement and making it more specific, like the big renovation concept as well. It's in the EED, but it's pretty vague, and member states can choose at the end what big renovation means in the boundaries that their directive allows them to. And of course also a better link between the deep renovation and the nearly zero energy buildings concept as well for the existing buildings. I think that would be also helpful. Thank you.
And then we have one there, and then Randall next. You go first then.
Oh, okay. Yeah, doing again. Just picking on Oliver's comment on more details on breaking down the building stock. In EFIG, we're actually working so far on we've identified 5 segments. So we've got the commercial buildings, then public buildings, and then the residential sector, because it's basically 2/3 of the floor surface. We've split between publicly owned, owner-occupied, and private rental. And I think an additional distinction that I would make is between those that are professionally managed and those that are not professionally managed. And you could say, you know, a small commercial space owned by somebody who owns 3 of this, so less than 1,000 square meters in Brussels, you're not talking about, you know, the same kind of object than somebody who's leasing this building, for example. It's a completely different universe, and the behaviors are very different. So I would say, let's keep that in mind. Another thing that comes out of the discussions in EFIG is you have to also introduce renovation at the right moment in the investment cycle as much as possible. And that, for example, I think there are 2 good examples that we could take. When we talk about taxation, I mean, carbon tax is one way to tax, but you could also have a change in the property taxes or in the fees you have to pay when you buy buildings. And if you green those, you know, that could have, it's always a marginal incentive, but it could play a role. And I was just discussing with Celine, who's telling me that they're actually implementing that in France. She's gone. And another good example is the UK's policy, where they say, I think 2018 or so, maybe someone correct me, basically F and G buildings can no longer be rented out, which is a pretty powerful signal to the market. And it's providing long-term visibility, which basically the building sector, which is a very immobile sector, needs, because, you know, it's a long-term sector, so you need to say things in advance. But I think it's an interesting policy. Not to say it should be done everywhere, but just putting that on the table.
And then Randall.
I don't want to stand in between us and the drink, but a quick question on cost optimality. I think I don't know if hopefully Paolo would be willing to give a quick answer. Paolo, you mentioned the intention to improve the guidance document, and then you pointed out how actually cost optimal is a bit over. It's pretty important now because getting into I know it's in the EED. In the Article 7, there's a reference in the guidelines to using the cost optimal for calculating eligibility, but it's also indirectly used in Article 5 on the public sector. It says existing codes, but EPBD, it's linked to the cost optimal. So my point is that it's sort of important. You agree? I think you may agree to that. The guidelines will, of course, help, but I'm just wondering, there's another thing that, looking at your diagrams and having looked at several member states' reports on how they implement it, and they often come up showing that their existing codes are very close to cost optimal. So you get a little suspicious. I'm just wondering how rigorous is the Commission in its attempts to check the methodologies from the member states, and if they are rigorous, what are the legal possibilities of doing something if you discover that they're sort of exaggerating?
We take before we do, we take the last one maybe.
A very much related question, very practical, just for information. You mentioned that Ecofis is doing the analysis of the national cost optimal studies that have been submitted. Is this information already available, or will it be made publicly available in the future? Just for information.
So yes, indeed, I highlighted the requirements on cost optimal calculations as quite important, because not only is an attempt to oblige member states to be more ambitious when they set the minimum performance requirements, but also is a kind of a dynamic requirement, because it needs to be, let's say, reviewed regularly in line with the provisions of the directive. So that's why over time these minimum performance requirements and the levels of cost optimality should in the end converge with the nearly zero energy buildings. So it's quite an important provision of the current EPBD. And the idea of possibly reviewing the guidelines would be to then, if as an outcome of this analysis of the national reports, we see that, for instance, some member states are, let's say, below a minimum level of ambition or are not addressing adequately some of the aspects, but still we have a delegated regulation and we have the provisions of Article 5. So we have quite a strong provisions. The guidelines is to further help member states. So on the basis of those strong provisions, your other question of how far we can go, so far this obligation for a report has been treated separately from the overall transposition of the directive. So we have launched EU pilots, which is like the first step of dialogue with the member states. And thanks to that, we have now practically all the national reports. We publish them gradually in our website. And then when there was no report, we have followed recently with a letter of formal notice against a member state which had not come up with the report, and then moved to reasoned opinion. And then in terms of, well, then first there is this check, yes, no report, and then there is the second check, okay, quality of the report, and there again, we could do two separate things, continue the cost optimal track until the end for infringements, or what we are doing, which is that since for already a third of the member states we have launched, let's say, the conformity infringement process, to include the cost optimal provisions in that conformity infringement process. And that, as for any other infringement, can be going up to the court if needed. But our aim is not to take member states to the court. So what we do is to have this quite intense dialogue that I mentioned, so that they come up, they review, they improve the report, and that we have seen that it has been working quite well. So we see member states continuously improving the report when needed. As regards the example that I put there, this, I mean, I should not say, but is one of the best examples. So it's a very ambitious report, so not all of the reports look like that. Just to but I thought that it was nice to put a very good one where you can see the effort that the member state did, how they use it even to assess the development of technologies in line with the cost optimal requirements, as you had mentioned. So which ones are already cost optimal, which ones still not. So they really did a very serious work in this case. And as regards the final publication, yes, our idea, as we usually do with all our studies, is on the one hand to publish the consultant report as such when it is ready, and then of course when the Commission report is ready, that will as well be published and communicated also to the other institutions.
And is there any idea about the timing?
Formally for closing, let's say, the analysis, it should be somewhere around February, so even until February we would be receiving updates from the member states, because through the pilot tool we are receiving improvements, and in the end we want to take them into account, but at some point you also need to cut. So I think that probably before the summer we should be able to publish, because the idea would be, since there are links to conformity, to give the opportunity to each member state to react on their analysis briefly, and then to close the report.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we were starting 5-10 minutes late, so if anyone who have a last question or comments, we also have time for that. We can go 5 minutes over time. I can see that the drinks are not here yet.
No, we will. Yes.
They'll come soon next time. So Adrian.
Yeah, just to pick up on Marianne's point about job creation. I don't know which model was used in Romania.
I want also to understand.
Okay, so you might talk about Romania in a moment, but the Energy Efficiency Industrial Forum commissioned a study, a desk study, of all existing studies of the job intensity for the investment of €1 million in various sectors. And that study demonstrated that for 1 million investment in energy renovation of buildings, on average in Europe, we create 19 jobs. So you can, and this is quite a reliable figure. The range often mentioned is 13 to 19 jobs. And if you extrapolate that with investment projections, then you can have a look at the kind of job creation potential. And in the Renovate Europe campaign, we've made such a calculation, which shows that there would be around 2 million new local direct jobs created by renovation activity in Europe in the year 2020. And when I've presented that in a similar seminar where the European Trade Union Confederation was present, their delegation said, I think you're very conservative with 2 million jobs. Let's work together and see if we can come to a better, more accurate figure. And it's a project I've never come to the end of, and I've tried to do it in eceee as well. Hans Nielsen's not here, but we've thought about this a little, to have a better methodology for projecting what new local non-displacement jobs are in the building sector. So it's a live topic, Marianne, and one that I hope to carve out a decent amount of time to deal with at some point. Because it's a very powerful
But I can also say on some of my experience working with this, but you could calculate job creation by sector in this kind bottom up, but to get the overall effect you have to put it into a macroeconomic model, so there could be impact on other sectors. And some economists and some modeling will say that after 5-6 years everything will crowd out, because if you create more jobs you increase salaries and then you have less jobs afterwards. So in 5-6 years we have no net jobs effect. That at least with Minister of Finance said in Denmark. So everything we do in 5-6 years there's no effect. So on jobs. So the answer on jobs are difficult. Not only in Denmark, but you could see that the impact assessment made by the European Commission of the 2030 communication, there was 2 macroeconomic models used there. They gave a positive job effect, both of them. So at least there's evidence for it.
Just to reply directly to Mariana's question, so we use a similar approach, just analyzing other studies and what other projects deliver. Again, how many jobs created for 1 million euros invested. But the easiest way to find direct job impact in the construction sector is to use Eurostat figures. You have their job intensity of the European construction sector of each country, and the number of jobs per added value created by the construction sector is more or less similar with the figure mentioned by Adrian. It's around 17, 18, depends of the year. We didn't have good years in the construction sector over the last time, but the job intensity in countries with let's say less developed, it's even higher in the construction sector. And moreover, we have indirect and induced jobs. in the supply chain industries, in the overall activities for certifying, auditing, and so on. So we were very conservative using for Romania the EU average, but we wanted to be on the ground and not to build high dreams. May I still continue since I step up, or do you want to go to drink, or you can go to drink and I can still continue? So I have some points here. So fuel poverty, I think that's an important question. And Paula mentioned that they want to introduce the Commission. That means some ex-ante conditionality on the use of the structure funds. I should say Houston we have a problem, or Brussels we have a problem, because we don't have a common definition. Well, actually we are speaking about fuel poverty, which is well defined in the British Islands, and also we have energy poverty, which is maybe larger, and the Commission used in the working group vulnerable consumers to energy prices. So we should find first a rule or standardization, what you showed that it was founded for financing in the EFIC group. Also, I may say that we analyzed in the same fuel poverty study the amount of subsidies allocated for winter heating in some countries and the investment in energy efficiency of the buildings. And in Greece, UK and Ireland was higher the subsidy than the amount of funds for energy efficiency. I'm not saying that all of them should be shifted, because there are some dispersed problems, but at least some of them can be restructured and moved to a positive impact investments. Should I continue? I have also to argue with the NZIB near zero energy buildings article from the directive. And you said, Peter, I think that the new buildings are completely covered, problem solved. Okay, almost. Nearby, nearly solved, the problem. I think analyzing through entrance and through our work how the NZIB is implemented in the member states, the bad news are that almost all of them are identifying near zero energy buildings with cost optimal levels. So I'm wondering what's the impact of the nearly zero energy building Article 9 from the directive in this case. And even at CEPBD I saw in the last week was a presentation assimilating one to another. So I think this is a problem. And also another problem, the last one I will close here. So, or may I continue? I have other 2 points inside. So it is a big problem with the two definition for renovation in EED and EPBD. We have deep renovation in EED, which means something, and major renovation in EPBD, which means other thing. But funny enough, even the Commission, harmonized these two and identify them, put the equal sign in the Horizon 2020 work programs on energy. You can have a look there, it's a footnote, identifying deep with major. And I think that's a misleading way to deal with them. And maybe we should replace deep with NZIP. And last point, we are speaking about regulation. It's true, the European policy and the European regulatory framework drag the national legislations, but we should also be careful to the level of supportability of the markets. Because if with a thin wire we try to lift a ton, maybe we can break it and will not be anymore a driver. So we should adapt it to the markets, and we should also push the markets with other type of measures. And I think
Thank you.
Beer.
I think we have to give Paula just a chance. She was at least sitting there. So if you have a small comment, please.
Well, it's more of an important comment, because either I misunderstood Randall's point, or you misunderstood Randall and my point, one of the two. Because in any case, what I said, I understood that he was asking about the future review, where Article 4 type of obligations, which right now is just to put in place a long-term renovation strategy, not necessarily even to apply it, So we are jumping too quickly, too high, I would say. So he said, if in the future there is a review of Article 4, would be in the future a possibility to make it an ex-ante conditionality. So in the future, a new type of Article 4 obligation for renovation, why not? So right now there is no such an obligation, there is no such a possibility, because as I said, energy efficiency directive cannot be introduced in the ex-ante conditionality, so I just found that it was misleading as a conclusion of what we had discussed. And the same for the link to DIPA major. I mean, you have reopened a whole new session, so I don't want to lengthen it too much. But there again, I think you summarize maybe too shortly something that is not exactly like that. There is no such obligation for deep renovation. In the EED, it's just a mention of stimulating towards that, while in the EPBD you have clear obligations in relation to that, so I mean, I would not consider them equivalent. That being said, yeah, for sure, we need guidance on early energy buildings looking at the definition. I mean, one thing doesn't exclude the other, but putting them just in a bundle maybe is a bit confusing, I would say.
Okay, I think we have come to an end. I think we have had very good presentations with a lot of new information and a lot of news. We have also had a good discussion. I think at least I've learned that, or heard again, that enforcement and strong implementation of existing regulation are really, really crucial. And if the Commission continue to be strong policemen and secure strong enforcement, then we will come a long way. But there's also room for improvements. There's room for showing best practice, good examples, and maybe also take them up. There's also room to do more on financing. Financing is one element, but not the only element. So we have heard a lot of these things. So by these, I think I will close. I think for sure we will follow up from eceee on buildings over the coming year to see what to do and what could be the future solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.